Good morning, Abundant Life Church. This is Pastor Chris. Today we're going to continue our study of Romans chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. When we left off, we were talking about the idea Paul calls us to be living sacrifices, not to be conformed to this world, but be transformed to God. Okay. All right. And we're asking ourselves, what does it mean to be a living sacrifice? What is it? Well, the first answer, obviously, is we need to put sins away. But again, as we talked about last time, the problem is that many people look at that as the only thing there is to being a living sacrifice. The only thing there is to following God is making sure you avoid all the things you're supposed to avoid and give up all the things you're supposed to give up. And that means not only do I give up all my sin, but now I have to watch myself every single minute so I don't sin anymore. You're like somebody who's on a very strict diet. You ever go to a restaurant with somebody's on a strict diet? And they say, well, does this food have this? Does it have this? Does it have this? Lots of fun to be with, aren't they? Here's the thing about chronic sin scorekeepers. They will spend their whole life making sure that they don't sin. And then when they're sure that, okay, I've got a pretty good handle on this, they start helping other people out, pointing out their sins. Isn't that what the Pharisees did? They were so into this, they even pointed out the things Jesus was doing wrong. How'd that turn out for him? If you strive for such sinlessness, then you're putting a lot of time and a lot of thought and a lot of actions into thinking about sin. You're not putting a lot of time into thinking about who God is, what God's nature is like. And unfortunately, this attitude usually leads people to either to guilt because they fail, or to feelings of superiority because they've convinced themselves they've succeeded. It can also lead to exhaustion and burnout, and you just think, that's it, I can't be a follower of Jesus, why try? One of my favorite speakers, one of my favorite authors and preachers is the late great Mike Yaconelli. And I once heard him say to pastors, stop preaching about another thing that people are doing wrong. There are some preachers out there that 52 times a year, people come and they hear yet another sermon about how they're not measuring up and what else they need to improve. Nobody can keep up with that. And the problem, Mike Yaconelli said, is when you do that, you're not talking about God, you're talking about them. Tell them what God is like. Describe God's nature and God's love and God's grace. They will naturally want to follow this guy. If being a living sacrifice is not about being a Pharisee and not about being a sin scorekeeper, and it's not about impressing God with how much we have avoided sins, then what is it? How do we present ourselves as living sacrifices? How do we say, Lord, I hope you're pleased with what I'm giving you here? So far, all we agreed on is that being a living sacrifice sounds like a good thing and it's something we should do. And yeah, it involves putting away some sins. But what else is there? Well, as with any biblical passage, we need to understand the context. So, what was Paul talking about just prior to this passage? He had been talking about God having such an unfathomable love and mercy for people who had rejected even his son. Just because they've rejected God's son, God hasn't stopped loving them. We have an unbelievably, unmeasurably loving God. So, what do we do in response to such an unbelievably loving God? Well, Paul says our response is we think of our lives as sacrifices to Him, but these are sacrifices of thanksgiving. You see, there was more than just, we think of when the people made sacrifices to God, it was all about, here's the sins I committed. Okay. That wasn't the only form of sacrifice. There was also sacrifices of thanksgiving. You actually see this today. You actually practice this today, believe it or not. When you sit down before a meal, what do? You say grace. What's another way of describing grace? Giving thanks. These are sacrifices where you offer something to God. Sometimes it is an animal that they offered in thanks to God. Sometimes it was part of their crop. Sometimes it was simply a prayer. So now we have the first part. We have the context that God loves even those who rejected his son. And now we have Paul's call to be living sacrifices. With this in mind, let's look at verse 3 now. For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourselves with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. It's a pretty hard thing to become arrogant with how many sins you have given up and want to brag to God about it. Remember, there were Gentiles in the church at this time who were feeling pretty smug right about now because we're saved. And these Jews who had followed God all their lives and had the covenants and all that, they're not. Did they have the right kind of minds? No, they needed transformed minds. With a transformed mind, you stop thinking about yourself. You stop thinking about how awful you are or how wonderful you are, and you focus on God. You focus on God. There were some feeling smug that they were spiritual and sinless and that they served God better than others. These so-called Christians who aren't measuring up to how awesome I am. That's not the right kind of attitude to serve God. And there's what Paul was talking about being a living sacrifice. Live your life in a way that you're exalting and glorifying God, not yourself. It's about putting away spiritual arrogance. Spiritual arrogance is a very big thing. It's about not looking down on others who are trying to serve and worship God, but who do it differently than you do. This smugness is not what being a living sacrifice means. Anytime two preachers get together and we start talking, you know what the first thing we ask is? How big is your church? Mm-hmm. We want to know, where do we rank? Are you above me? Are you below me? What have you? And you start to see that. You start to see that with preachers. And I've actually had to fight against that a few times. I remember one time I had to call Leroy Lawson. That name may not mean something to you, but that's a big name. Leroy Lawson was the pastor of a church in Arizona of about 7,000 people, but he had a second job. His second job was he was the president of Hope International University, where I got my master's. He was the pastor of a megachurch at the same time that he was the president of a college. That's impressive. Oh, he was also a well-known speaker and author. He's way up here on the ladder, and I had to call him about, I don't even remember what the matter was I had to call him about. I'm thinking he will have no idea who I was. I had met him once before, and we had spoken for all of about 4 seconds. I had met him with a group of people and just said, hello, Dr. Lawson. I'm, one of the graduate students here. That was it. That was our whole relationship. And so when I called him, surprisingly, he answered the phone. I figured I'd have to go through some operator. He answered the phone. And I said, Dr. Lawson, hi. I gave him my name. I said, hey, I'm a graduate of Hope. I met you very briefly. I know you. He goes, oh, sure, Chris, I remember you. I thought, no, you don't. You don't remember me. And then all of a sudden he said, how are things going? At Powell Butte, he named the church I was at. He said, I sure am proud of the work you're doing there. Now, I know he had a computer screen and had punched my name in, and okay, he had some information on me. But here's the thing. He kept asking me questions about me. And I kept thinking, you're the president of a college. You're the pastor of a megachurch. Usually when you meet somebody like that, all they want to talk about is themselves. And I realized what really made Dr. Lawson a great man was his humility, not his accomplishments, his humility and his focus on God. This is what it means to be a living sacrifice. Now, we'll talk some more about this next time. Till then, have a great day.